Okay, welcome to part two of my guide to the IT crowd. Make sure you look at part one and part three as well. The fact that we get this establishing shot that tilts up the building, and then we see this kind of shot reverse shot scene between her and Douglas, with him on one side of the door and her on the other side of the door, adds to this idea that the rest of the building and the rest of the staff are completely different and separate and segregated to Jen and Roy and Moss downstairs in the basement. So she tries to integrate, tries to go into the room, but the camera shots frame her as being trapped. And we see this kind of like close-ups on her face. You know, she's framed within the kind of door frame and the door. And we get this kind of back and forth between her and Douglas, with him being quite secretive as well. And so this adds to this idea that she is literally shut out in terms of the door, but also kind of emotionally and socially shut off from the rest of the staff. Her excuse that there have been RAM emergencies is funny because we as an audience know she's just making this up. Adds to her representation as being somebody who doesn't necessarily know anything about technology at all. It also adds to the idea that she's been making excuses not to go to meetings and therefore perhaps suggests she doesn't really enjoy her job. But the fact that her boss, Douglas, does not pick up on this as being a ridiculous or made up excuse represents him as being quite stupid and easily fooled. We see Moss in this wide shot of a kind of what is supposed to be what's called a green room. I know it's blue, but it's basically a backstage room at the Countdown Studios. And the reason it's filmed on this wide shot is it gives him lots of space around him. It makes him seem quite isolated and alone. And that helps us see him as being quite socially isolated, which is something that is particularly common when we see kind of geek type characters in programs. We then hear Prime for the first time. We don't necessarily see him. This dialogue is what's called a sound bridge. It's sound from the shot of Prime, but we're seeing it over the top of the shot of Moss. So we are hearing him before we see him, and that creates enigma. It makes him seem mysterious because we don't know who's talking. He has quite a slow, mysterious way of speaking. His tone of voice is quite mysterious as well. And as well as that, we see him in a low angle shot looking up at him, which makes him seem quite powerful and dominant. Added to that, with his kind of black long coat and black glasses and the way he's standing, it adds to this idea that he's kind of a very powerful, dominant, but mysterious figure. And it also acts as an intertextual reference to Morpheus from The Matrix, which the people who watch the IT crowd may fall into the age range that may be familiar with that film. And Morpheus was also a very wise, very mysterious character. So the representation and the intertextual reference kind of tie together in that respect. This enigmatic representation is just added to when we see him do his kind of magic trick, flicking the card. Although it seems quite humorous, it's that idea of being a little bit magic and mysterious. And again, when he kind of shuffles off sideways at the end, it's almost a parody on the way that kind of these wise old characters were represented in older films. And so it's funny, but it also adds to that idea that he's maybe quite a wise, advising kind of character. We get a shot reverse shot scene between Roy and Alistair and his girlfriend. And what that means is we see Roy in one shot, and then the editor chooses to cut to Alistair and his girlfriend, and it goes back and forth between those two groups of characters, rather than necessarily showing them in the screen together in like a 2 or a 3 shot. And what that does, that choice of editing and camera technique, is there to show the difference between them. It makes them seem very different as characters. We see Roy again with another graphic crumpled t-shirt, you know, a kind of satchel type bag, quite casual, very laid back and informal, versus Alistair in his suit. And he looks very smart, very professional, quite mature because his clothes are kind of blacks and greys. And his girlfriend is also dressed in what looks like a kind of quite smart professional outfit as well. They look reasonably kind of a middle to higher class in comparison to Roy's more kind of working class casual outfit. So the use of the costumes and that editing technique of going back and forth between them shows them as very, very different people. We get the idea that Alistair and his girlfriend are perhaps a bit judgmental of Roy. We see his girlfriend kind of look Roy up and down, which suggests she's judging the way he looks. And we also see Alistair not bothering to ask Roy any questions about himself. So, Roy says, "You look great," but Alistair just says, "Thanks," rather than the social norm of saying, "Oh, you look great too." And then Roy asks Alistair about his job, and Alistair replies, but doesn't ask Roy the same back. And so it implies that perhaps Alistair represents him as being quite snobby, maybe not really caring about Roy and what he does. And it also, we see Roy's annoyed facial expressions on this kind of close up or medium close up shot. And we know how frustrated he is and how annoying he finds it. So the use of the camera shots help to represent Roy as being really irritated by the fact that this man is doing so well and clearly doesn't care about him and his life. There are several points within the episode where Roy uses bad language, swearing, whatever you want to call it. He calls Alistair a twat under his breath, although the subtitles don't actually pick up on that. And he uses the word bollocks a couple of times as well. He even says, "I don't give a shit," a couple of times too. So the use of the profanity within his dialogue represent him as being somebody who, again, is quite perhaps working class, maybe somebody who's not that professional or mature as well. And also the context in which he uses them perhaps maybe make him seem a little bit aggressive or belligerent or rude. This representation of Roy being a bit rude is added to when he calls the window washer, whose name he doesn't know, Window Washer Willie from West Gibberish. So the use of a kind of nickname or a label, it feels like he's mocking the man, and saying West Gibberish as though that's where he comes from, like a made up silly location name. It does feel as though Roy doesn't have any respect for him at all. And obviously that's emphasized when we find out that he's had some kind of accident and is in hospital. And Roy literally just sort of says it offhand, like as though it's just an inconvenience for him. So his tone of voice and the way he says it and what he says adds to the representation of Roy being somebody that really doesn't care about other people at all and that he's quite selfish. The woman standing outside the 8+ club on the door is represented in quite a conventional way for women, so quite sexualized. She's got her hand on her hip, she's standing in a particular way that emphasizes her body shape. She's wearing a very form-fitting dress, she's got her hair and makeup done, very traditionally attractive. And so I think that representation helps to add to the humor because we're seeing her outside a door that is very bashed up and graffitied. And then obviously the idea is it's some kind of club for countdown winners. So the representation of her as being this very beautiful sexual woman stood outside a kind of very working class office door that's all banged up. It's that juxtaposition, the contrast, the binary opposites, and it makes it more funny. When Moss gets into the club, we get the quite dramatic music and we get the shots of the countdown winners or the geeks drinking and looking popular. We get lots of wide shots showing them with lots of friends in their shots, showing them as being very popular. We see people smiling and talking to them, which again adds to their representation of being very successful. We see lots of women, very beautiful women, walking around the shots. It's very conventional sexualized images of women for the most part, but it also adds to the representation of the men and the countdown winners seeming very attractive to people. This scene is filmed through a point of view shot, which means that we are literally seeing through Moss's eyes. It's a handheld camera shot tracking through the bar. And this handheld camera shot helps us to feel as though we are Moss. It puts us in his shoes. So it's engaging the audience by making us feel connected to him and seeing the club through his eyes. Again, we get lots of low angle camera shots here of Moss and Prime, which adds to their representation of being important in this environment. It makes them seem very powerful. The music in the next scene has quite a comical tone to it, feels quite silly, like physical humour, and that adds to the representation of Roy being quite silly and stupid and immature as well. We see him see Alistair and his reaction, the screech of the bikes, the look of horror on his face as it dawns on him that Alistair has seen him, shows us that he really cares about what other people think. He's very concerned about the image that he has, to other people, and that he's so worried that it's going to, drive him crazy trying to correct Alistair's image of him. He refers to Alistair's girlfriend as a creature, so he says that creature that he was with. Now, admittedly, he's trying to say it in a positive, flattering way, so he means it as a compliment. But the fact that he's referring to this woman as a creature kind of does suggest that he doesn't see her as human. It dehumanizes her. So it kind of suggests she's like an object to be ogled. So again, representing him as being quite misogynistic. Moss and Jen discuss the super secret meetings that they are concerned might be going on upstairs, and the use of that phrase is quite childlike and immature as well, so perhaps suggesting that they are quite childlike and immature. The fact that Roy immediately suggests that orgies are the most likely thing to be happening in these meetings suggests that, again, he's quite the kind of single bachelor, that his mind goes straight to sex, that kind of gives you a hint as to the type of man he is portrayed to be. The fact that Moss suggests that it might be rewards like massages for people who've performed really well at work is quite sweet but quite naive, that he thinks that's the way it might work. Okay, so that was my part 2 guide to the IT crowd. Please make sure that you check out part 1 and part 3 as well.